debate. The motion before the House tonight is this House believes that the British Empire is a national disgrace. I look to the first speaker, Melanie Onovo, Christchurch Treasurer, to open the case for the proposition.
I want to make this debate crystal clear from the very beginning. Shame in the British Empire is not the same as shame in Britishness as a whole. I'm a Nigerian British citizen, and there are many parts of Britishness that I'm proud of. The National Health Service, fish and chips. I would say good afternoon tea, but famously, tea's not really British. Despite many things that we have to be proud of about Britishness today, we suffer a high amount of colonial nostalgia for the empire. As a British Nigerian woman in the UK, it's incredibly difficult to feel a part of a country that celebrates a colonial past that promoted slavery, pillage, and the robbery of Nigerians and Africans alike, and were complicit in the transportation of millions of Africans across the globe in chains because they were perceived as a lesser race and as a commodity for profit. Walking through the Oxford Union itself, there are several portraits celebrating agents of the British Empire and colonial leaders such as Lord Curzon, who are representative of more than just the physical capture and seizure of territory in the past, but also perpetuate a culture of British superiority that is deeply pernicious for several reasons. It creates an environment of otherness for non-white British people who are constantly reminded of the atrocities that were committed against people like them, the racism, the xenophobia that they have suffered in the country in which they reside. Beyond this, it also reinforces a white nationalism that fuels divide and current xenophobic and racist attitudes that work to marginalize people who are only here because of the result of the Asian or African diasporas, who are only here as a result of the destitute conditions in which the empire left their countries. To me, it's therefore inconceivable how we can still feel so much pride in a part of our history that caused so much suffering and has had a divisive impact on the future of this country. I can never cover all the reasons why the British Empire is a national disgrace in a 10-minute speech, but I hope in the 3 reasons that I give you today, you'll understand why we should feel shame in the British Empire, and I'm able to convince you to walk through the doors that say "I" tonight. Firstly, the British Empire is a national disgrace for the atrocities it committed and attempted to bury in the colonial regime. Secondly, for the nationalist sentiment it has espoused in contemporary society as a result of perpetuated ideals of British superiority, caused by a continual pride in the empire and apathy to its harms. Thirdly, for the economic cripple the empire left its ex-colonies in as a result of its extractive policies. But before I go on, it falls upon me to introduce the opposition side for tonight's debate. In first opposition is Harry Deacon, a second-year economics and management student from Pembroke College. More fun facts about Harry is that his Irish nationality makes 90% of his personality. So unless he's found some way to erase the history of famine and starvation caused by the empire in Ireland, I'm unsure how he can sincerely represent the side on which he sits today. In second opposition is Matthew Robbins. From New York City, it may be too far back in America's past to remember their time as a British colony, considering it is clear that America themselves failed to acknowledge the gravity of harm that they caused in their own past. In third opposition is Mr. Zarir Mazani. And as you do, I did some reading about him and his work, and saw all his writing on the British Empire and the Raj, and I thought, wow, this guy's woke. How's woefully mistaken. In The Telegraph, he says the British Empire was a matter for pride, not guilt, as we Indians know. Well, I'm sure that many Indians who also who've also learned about the 5 million deaths that occurred as a result of famine, that was directly associated with the exportation of Indian resources to be produced and sold by the empire. I'm sure that many would not agree with you. Madam President, these are your speakers, and they are most welcome. Now on to my first argument. When British imperialists created the notion of free trade, what they really meant was freedom of the British to take whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted and by any means necessary. This did not just mean land resources, but also meant human resources. People that were dehumanized and treated as less than human, justified under defunct and inaccurate Darwinistic assumptions of humanity. The British transatlantic slave trade was most dominant between the years 1640 to 1807 and was responsible for the transportation of more than 3.1 million people across the Atlantic. Of these 3.1 million, only 2.7 arrived. That is 3.1 million fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, children, ripped from their families, beaten into subservience, shackled in cages, and stripped of their own names, all in the name of free trade and labor. Yet the stories that we are told are the works of the British Empire post-abolition to get rid of slavery across the globe. This ignores the damage done by the hundreds of years in the slave trade and the active facilitation of the transportation of slaves across the globe, even post-abolition. There is a total denial of the justifications on cultural grounds for slavery that was capitalized on by other sinister world powers as a result of the British Empire. In The Guardian, a YouGov survey showed that 30% of Britons believed that the colonies were better off as part of the British Empire. This was just 2 days ago. And it's a frightening revelation to the extent that we hold the British Empire as a source of our national pride. The British Empire is a moral disgrace, and pay attention to the fact that I use present tense here, because we can only truly move forward in a direction of tolerance once we free ourselves from our colonial past. Moving on to my second argument about nationalistic sentiment and the moral ineptitude of the British Empire. In 2012, the British Foreign Office admitted that thousands of records documenting the atrocities committed by the British Army and colonial service were deliberately destroyed, and this culture of underground injustice perpetrated against victims of our colonial past still exists today. Amber Rudd and her drama with the UN Women was very conveniently timed for this debate. We must not forget that what the Windrush scandal represented. Amber Rudd is not the cause, but symptomatic of a broken immigration policy and Home Office that continues to reinforce the disposable nature of non-white British residents and the continued disposition of the government to hide their immorality in the face of scrutiny. The African Caribbean Society exists to make its members feel comfortable in an environment that continues in perpetuity to scapegoat, vilify, and marginalize members of this community, and it's not something that we should tolerate. The sheer amount of apathy surrounding the British Empire in the public is incredibly alarming, and the results of this is that there's not enough enthusiasm to make Britain a welcoming environment for its non-white residents, since people don't seem to understand the moral reprehensibility of the empire and that the British race is not superior than any other. We show this blatantly through our continued display of artifacts that we've stolen and plundered from ex-colonies in the British Empire. The British Empire stole 4,000 artifacts from Nigeria after its capture in 1897. And now these artifacts are in museums in the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, and Austria. But guess where they're not? In Nigeria, the country of their origin. The continued display of our robbery of culture and resources of ex-colonies sends a signal of pride in the plunder of these nations. Pride in the destruction of these native populations and languages, when we should all feel disgust. Despite all of this, there are defenders of the empire with arguments of the economic benefits that were afforded to the colonies of the empire. This is a fallacy. Take India, for example. In 1820, India accounted for 60% of the world's total GDP, and only 4% by 1947. The British deindustrialized India to siphon funds in the hands of the wealthy upper class in Britain shows a total disregard for the development of the nations in its periphery. The railways built by the British Empire, chartered under the East Africa Company, the East India Company, the British Raj, and other colonial projects were purely for extractive purposes, to facilitate transport of opium to East Asia to fuel an opioid addiction to its people, or transport of tea that became the pride of Britain despite it not being British at all. the transport of rubbers and rare metals, using free slave labor of the natives residing there. The British Empire is a national disgrace because of the impact of its extractive measures have led to, the underdevelopment of many colonies that have made them vulnerable to new submersive and asymmetric relationships with Western powers, even in the era of their own independence. The colonies that left the imperial relationship with any economic independence, such as Canada and Australia, were only able to do so as being settler colonies, which required, at some extent, the expulsion and slaughter of indigenous populations of these countries, a part of our history that we still too readily forget. Don't get me wrong here, I'm proud to be British. As a Nigerian British woman, I take pride in my identity as a member of global Britain, one that looks forward, not backwards. A Britain that is accountable for its past and acknowledges the long ways it has to go before we can get to a truly open and equal society. 100 years ago, I would never expected someone of my ethnicity or gender to be at this university. 50 years ago, I would have never expected somebody like me to speak in this historic chamber. And 10 years ago, I would never have dreamt of being here as the treasurer of the Oxford Union. And I want to make one thing clear. A modern and global Britain should not be a Britain that is consumed with obsession over its past exploitation, murders, and unjust wars. We must come to terms with our colonial past and use it as a reason to do better so we can create a Britain with achievements to be proud of. A Britain that accepts the empire is a national disgrace, is a Britain that can unite for a better future for all. Thank you.